Hello and welcome. We're delighted to have you join us. My name is Catherine Baisden, and I am the project manager for the Peers Data Hub. Peers stands for Partnership for Expanding Educational Research in STEM. The Peers Data Hub is located at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, or ICPSR, and is funded by the National Science Foundation. It is a collaborative initiative between the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and ICPSR. The Peers Data Hub is a space for research communities to use wide-ranging data and advance knowledge on STEM education by sharing innovative ideas, methods, and tools. If you would like to know more and also register for upcoming webinars for free, such as this one, please visit the Peers Data Hub website at www.peersdatahub.net. Today's webinar description is many U.S. states have developed statewide longitudinal data systems that house and link administrative education records from pre-K through post-secondary education. This talk will provide an overview of one such statewide longitudinal data system, the Michigan Education Data Center. With us today from the Michigan Education Data Center is Kevin Stang and Kyle Quaiser. Kevin Stang is a professor of public policy and co-director of the Education Policy Initiative at the University of Michigan, where he teaches graduate courses in higher education policy, economics, and quantitative methods. He is also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the Marcel Family School of Education at the University of Michigan. Kyle Quaiser is the Senior Data Architect for the Michigan Education Data Center. Kyle's key focus is to keep the data and metadata flowing from the state of Michigan to researchers. He supports the MEDC website, the MEDC's research application portal, its data warehouse, and the integration of all three. He's also working with the state of Michigan education partners as they move to adopt the Common Education Data Standard and modernize their underlying technology stack. In addition, we have other members of the Peers Data Hub team joining us. Allison Plaster is an assistant research scientist at ICPSR, and she will be moderating the Q&A after the presentation. We will also be joined during the Q&A by AER Professional Development Director George Wimberly. He's going to try to stop and he's going to share information with you about the SLDS and the AERA NSF grant program, which is a great funding and training opportunity for researchers who wish to use secondary data to conduct rigorous policy and practice relevant educational research. I would like to say thank you in advance to all our panelists and also your contributions as attendees. Dr. Stang, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for organizing this, the invitation, and especially thank you to the 160 or so folks I see joining us. I'm really delighted that you are going to share this time with us. As Catherine mentioned, we're going to talk about state longitudinal data systems. We'll have a bit of a focus on Michigan, since that's the state's data system that my team here helps run. But I'll try to start by putting it up in the context of a broader kind of national, the broader national context. What we're going to do today, if I can get the slides working, is I'll give you just a brief kind of context of what state longitudinal data systems are, where they come from, why they exist. I'll hand it over to Kyle for a bit to give a deep dive on the data center that we operate here in Michigan. What's in it? How do you access it? There was a lot of questions that folks had in the registration for this webinar about how do you access the data and what's that process look like. So we'll be able to answer some of those questions. And then obviously we'll be able to answer some questions in the Q&A as well. And then I'll just give you a flavor of two kind of example projects using the data from Michigan that I worked on. There are many many ways you can use the data. This is just 2 projects that come out of this data. But just to give you a little brief taste of what you can do with it. Briefly mention about funding, and then hand it over to George to talk a little bit more about what AERA is doing on the funding thing, but also various professional development programs that they operate. And then we'll definitely have some time for Q&A. Okay, so that's where we're going. Let me just give you a little bit of context. So stepping outside of education for a moment, there's just really been a revolution in empirical social science in many disciplines. So I'm an economist who studies education. So a lot of the comments I make will be sort of coming from that lens, but this is true across all the social sciences. So this graph just shows you for people doing economic research, some of the main journals that publish economic research, what share of the papers in those journals are using administrative data over a 30-year time window here. And you can see there's just a huge growth going from approximately 0 in some of the journals in the 80s to well over half the papers in economics journals are using administrative data of some form. And this is just a graph that can easily get from my field, but again, this is a phenomenon that is true in basically every social science field. This is also true, particularly in education. So within education, I mostly work in higher education policy. Just as a little anecdote to this trend, there were 2 conference volumes related to higher education institutions. The more latter one in 2020 that I edited, and then there was another one 30 years earlier. And this just shows you of the chapters in those book volumes, what share of the chapters relied on admin data versus survey data versus some more theoretical, conceptual kind of focus. And in the book that we just edited, basically all but 2 of the chapters used administrative data to study higher education. 30 years ago, there were only 2 chapters that used what we would consider administrative data. And again, this is in higher education and with kind of an economics lens, but this phenomenon is just is much broader than that. Why? Well, administrative data is often used where you might see some of the more traditional surveys used to study various research questions. And so in education, I have in mind kind of all the really terrific NCES longitudinal studies, like NELS and ELS and college and beyond, or sorry, bachelor's and beyond, and beginning post-secondary survey. These are all, this is kind of the data I used in my dissertation many years ago before admin data was really easily accessible. But there's a number of other ones. NSF has a survey of recent college graduates, survey of earned doctorates. Then there's always the census and the ACS. So for a long time, those surveys were kind of the workhorse of education research. But now there's a lot more use of administrative data. Why? Well, administrative data has many benefits. The biggest being that admin data can be huge, right? They could be just very large samples. And so that allows you to drill into specific populations or subsamples with statistical power that you really can't get to in surveys. So for instance, Native American students are very tend to be a small group within many surveys. And so it's really hard to say anything about them systematically sometimes because of sample size issues. But with administrative data, you often have the power to, for instance. It also lets you use sometimes more innovative research designs. You could use things like regression discontinuity that requires a lot of data. So a couple other benefits. It's collected through the process of administering programs, and so researchers don't have to go out and collect the data themselves, which can be really expensive. There tends to be less measurement error, at least in some ways, than surveys. Asking people, what their, whether they were eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Students may not have any idea, but it actually is in the administrative data with pretty little measurement error. There tends to be low attrition. And then also, and this will come up in one of the projects I'll talk about, it tends to be pretty timely and high frequency. So you might be able to get data and information about students and how they're doing at a much higher frequency than you can from some of the survey sources. Drawbacks, which is why this is not meant to be an indictment of survey data, but rather I think of admin and survey data as being complementary. Some drawbacks of admin data tends to be fairly limited in terms of the variables that it has, the measures that it includes, because it's only including data that is used for administrative purposes. There often are kind of matching issues, like you want to sometimes merge one data set with another, and you have to worry about matching. Access is one issue. Historically, maybe you needed to know somebody in order to get access to administrative data. Centers like the center that we'll be talking about today, our goal is really to break down those access barriers. And then there's a couple other limitations, but in general, I think you've seen a big growth in the use of this kind of data in education research, in large part because I think the benefits here outweigh the drawbacks. NSLDS, Statewide Longitudinal Data Systems, are basically the major source of administrative data used in education research. Often they contain data from 4 domains: early learning, like pre-K. K-12 is usually kind of the backbone, the core of SLDSs. Post-secondary data, which is where I've mostly used, and then workforce data. Sometimes many states have earnings data for their residents that they've been able to link to education records, so you could look at some of the longer-term consequences of various educational outcome experiences. And then in Kyle, we'll go into a little bit more detail on this. Each of these domains contains a whole bunch of other things too, right? So within K-12, you might have information about K-12 enrollment, students' test scores, demographics, attendance, discipline, sometimes teachers. And then sometimes some states bring in other domains, like from criminal justice or health and human services, or have a mechanism through which you can link data from those other domains to the NSLDS. And Michigan is an example of that, where we sometimes do that kind of thing. The data is always de-identified in the sense that students will just have a number, right? You can't tell who's who because of privacy reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But there's usually an identifier that you can link people across data and over time. Largely funded, though not exclusively, but by a series of grant programs by the U.S. Department of Education. I'm not the historian to give this view, but my understanding is that a lot of this is a legacy of basically test-based accountability that was embedded in No Child Left Behind. Once you start requiring states to test all their students, you need data systems to store all that data. Once that data is stored, there's other things you could do with it. And so that sort of led to some of the research. This is what NSLDS are. So how does it look like across the country? This is data from, it's maybe a little bit dated by now, but I think the picture is not changed dramatically. So as of 3 years ago, there were 40 states that had a SLDS that linked at least 2 of those domains. You could see those in green. This, I think, kind of understates the extent of what's available out there, because there are some states like California and New York that have actually pretty well-developed systems, but just don't connect for the whole state. So California, there's data on the Cal State system, in New York, the CUNY system, but sometimes those things don't connect to the other domains. A lot fewer states have data from all 4 of these domains linked together. So the report from the Education of the Commission of the States listed 19 states that had linkages across all 4. My understanding is that that's maybe a bit of an overstatement, because I think I work a bit with the workforce data, and I don't think that's as easily to get in this many states. But anyways, this gives you just a broad picture. So now I'm gonna hand it over to Kyle to sort of talk about the Michigan specific data center that we help operate.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Thanks everybody for joining. So yeah, let's focus in on the Michigan Education Data Center. And before we get too far in, though, I just want to talk about the context in which we operate. So we are part of a collaboration between 4 different entities. We call that collaboration the Michigan Education Research Institute. Those 4 entities are 2 at the state level, the Michigan Department of Education, who has kind of operational responsibilities over the various districts in the state, and the Center for Educational Performance and Information. So MDE being the former, CEPI being the latter. CEPI, the Center for Education Performance and Information, I think of as the reporting body, the data collection body that operates closely and hand in hand with the Michigan Department of Education data, or Michigan Department of Education. So when we receive data from the state of Michigan, it's flowing from the districts to CEPI and then to the Michigan Education Data Center. Our role in this is to collect or field the data coming in from the state and collect research applications from prospective researchers, guide the researchers through the application process, and if the state approves it, because they retain ownership over the data, the Michigan Education Data Center will distribute the data to those other groups. The final partner is at Michigan State University, the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative. They are kind of a sister organization to the Michigan Education Data Center, except their role is different in that they act as kind of on-demand policy analysts for the Michigan Department of Education. Okay. And finally, I just want to mention that the Michigan Education Data Center is located within the Education Policy Initiative, which is our kind of parent research group at the University of Michigan. Okay, so what do we hold? What are the holdings? What does the state send over to us? So this is a true P20 system. So we have students, youths actually, spanning from 0 to 1 years of age up until the post-secondary. And what we've done, what we have is a standardized data formats of 10 plus collection systems that our partners, CEPI, runs. So data flows in from the districts and institutions to our partners at the state level. The data gets standardized, flattened out, and standardized and documented, and then sent to the Michigan Education Data Center. So looking at this, I want to start in the center because these are our main student data set. So at the bottom there, we have early learning. These are the students of age 0 to 5. In early on, so Great Start, Head Start type programs, and 3 to 5 into what we call the early childhood program. So that early learning box is more typically your special education programs before the K-12 system comes into play. We have a student identifier that connects, all students throughout these different boxes, so we can see them matriculate up into the K-12 student area, where Kevin gave you some sense there. We've got the enrollment records, like what schools, when did they enroll, demographics, maybe programs that they're enrolled in, as in English language learner, and other characteristics like that will come through. We have course taking data for a variety of subpopulations, and in a couple of years we have comprehensive course taking data. But these will allow a researcher to know what courses a student was taking, and then also it actually associates the student with the teacher that was teaching the course, or teachers as it is. But it's comprehensive for special education, for virtual course takers, for migrant students, but for the broader population universe, it depends on the year. And that's one of the things that comes with the administrative data, because the state only collects the data that's required by the legislature or state or federal guidelines. So if a requirement's rolled back, the data can get rolled back as well. We also have the discipline data within the K-12 student, and that covers more comprehensively suspensions, expulsions, with more of a convenient sample of suspension data, but it's comprehensive for certain subpopulations like special education. Okay. And of course, then you can watch these students matriculate into post-secondary, where we have enrollments, demographics, we have the courses that they're taking, the programs that they subscribe to and the awards that they are earning. Okay. To kind of round out the student level data, we do have a variety of assessment data sets. Our summative assessment is in Michigan is called MSTEP. That's what most students are taking throughout their time in K-12. But we also have PSAT and SAT, which are administered during the K-12, and the work skills and ACT test. Additionally, not mentioned on here is the advanced placement testing. So students who take AP exams are also captured in the assessments area. On the K-12 side, over on the kind of the left-hand side, we have the K-12 staff. So who are the teachers, who are the bus drivers, the administrators who are interacting with students, and we have their demographics, credentials. We know when their employment started, when it finished, maybe what schools they moved to, and for teachers, we know what grades they're teaching and what classes they're teaching in many cases. Along with that also is the professional development. So there is a way to link those directly to students. It's not always possible, depending on the population we're talking about, but using the K-12 infrastructure data, we can find the context of what teachers are in which schools with which students, how many counselors, for example, are at a school, how many teachers are moving in and out of the school, how many vacant positions are there. So that gives you an overall idea. And the next slide, I believe we'll talk about the years of data available. So generally, I think about this. Well, first of all, this picture is a little bit more complex because there are a lot of different data systems in play. So if you visit that URL down at the bottom, we have a more kind of detailed accounting of the years and data and when new versions or when they get updated. But generally, I think about this as a roughly 20-year panel where we have staff, students, assessments, and infrastructure, K-12 students starting in around 2003, 2004. Okay. The early learning jumps in a little bit later in 2013, and post-secondary is kind of splits the difference. We have pretty comprehensive coverage of post-secondary attendance starting in 2010. So what's the kind of purpose and value add? This gives us a nice example of what we're accomplishing and how this is serving researchers, I believe. So and specific to post-secondary, where the state collects. So we're looking at post-secondary enrollment award information. So the state has its own collection of information coming primarily from public IHEs, Institutes of Higher Education. So it would be your 4 years and your 2 years that are publicly funded. The state source data also includes independent IHEs that volunteer or choose to participate. Okay, so that gives us course level data. It gives us demographics, a little bit richer data set than our nationally sourced data set. But of course, the nationally sourced being National Student Clearinghouse data, does cover students who go out of the state of Michigan to attend post-secondary elsewhere. Now, we combine these two overlapping but distinct databases essentially, so that researchers don't have to. And because it allows us and allows researchers to use roughly the same numbers and achieve similar outcomes. That's an important aspect from the state's perspective, is kind of enabling researchers to come to, on basic counts, come to similar outcomes. So on the bottom here, we have 3 different ways in which you can combine these 2 different databases. One is combine and deduplicate. Just smash them all together, find the duplicate awards, find the duplicate enrollments, and deduplicate. A lot harder than it sounds because those programs, those awards can be slightly named differently. They can have slightly different start and end dates depending on which system they go to. So this has led to an inflation of award counts. It's good for like Booleans. Did they get an award? Did a student get an award? Falls apart though when we look at counts. So that was actually attempted, and we moved away from that and evaluated the next 2. One source per institution. The state values and believes the state source data are more accurate. So we looked at, if we have a submission from an institution in a year, let's just take that record and take all unique year and institution contributions from the nationally sourced data where appropriate. Well, that leads to an undercounting. because these submissions end at different points in time. Students come in and out, records get updated. And so we found we were missing enrollment information. So what we ended up doing is kind of the best of both worlds, a little bit more complex, but looking at the state and nationally sourced data and making sure that we get unique student year institution records from the two, combine them together and get that accounting. Go ahead, Kevin. Okay, what else do we have to offer? What else is there? Rich metadata. Folks don't generally like creating metadata, but they love to read it and understand the data they're working with. So we have descriptive narratives on our website, which describe the variety of data sets that we have. At the bottom of the page, when you go and see it, you'll see all the variables associated with that data set. We've got detailed technical notes generated by subject matter experts. Those are folks, data analysts at the state of Michigan with our CEPI partners who do a tremendously great job of providing these data. And because of all this, we can track data from the originating systems through to these final researcher files and figure out and identify any bugs and data issues and address them. We also have a monthly process where we submit questions to our state partners that come from researchers helping you get answers. Go ahead, Kevin. Okay. We also do matching. So if you do have survey data and you want to combine it with administrative data, this is where it comes into play. And that's enabled by our comprehensive personally identifiable information. So you can see we've got kind of 3 separate data sets, kind of preschool up through 12th grade, like kind of our K-12 data set, post-secondary, and the K-12 staff. You can see the birth dates range a little bit, but generally for students, we'll start in 1984. And we have a lot of records. So we've got about, 10 million records altogether. For our K-12 students, we do have address information, and we've used that to do matches to addresses like from voter files or from home addresses where we had lead pipe information, allowing us to join water quality and kind of infrastructure data to the student data. On the lower left here, we use R's FastLink implementation of the Fliggy-Sunter model is kind of just it's a probabilistic matching model, allows us to remain flexible and input new fields as researchers come up with new ideas, because if there's anything I know, it's that you all are very good at that. So on the left, you'll see just kind of a distribution by birth year of our K-12 student data, and you can kind of see it really picks up in the 80s and then flags off in the late 2000s or early 2000s. On the lower right, that's just how we evaluate our model outcomes and come out to a kind of a probability cutoff for our individual matches that maximizes our true positives and minimizes, for example, our false positives. So we know there will be error, but we take a good deal of effort to minimize that. Next. Okay, so as you go to apply, on the left here, you'll see we license software called SurveyMonkey Apply, and in it, we have a fairly robust workflow of information that you would need to provide. A little hard to see here, but we've got PI and study information, who's going to be on your project team, of course, asking for study details, how you're going to analyze and disseminate the data. Of course, my favorite part, the data request. And that's this little diagram on the lower right there gets to that. So if you'll go in and select post-secondary, and you'll be presented with demographics, enrollment attendance as little check boxes. And those categories actually map fairly directly to our MEDC website. So as you're on there perusing and browsing, there's a one-to-one correspondence between what you'll be selecting on our research application portal and what we have up on our website, which is all tied into our data warehouse. Go ahead, Kevin. I am not actually the person to give you all the tips on how to do a good research application, but I have a couple. Our colleague Jasmina is the one that really helps guide folks through that. So my suggestions, I would say, keep in mind these data are FERPA protected. Okay, so in order for the data to be released to you, you've got to meet one of 2 exceptions, and you're going to want to look into that. That little diagram or box on the lower left gets into some of the FERPA exceptions. We can help you with that, but you're either going to be using a studies exception where, say, you are improving instruction, or you're doing an audit or evaluation of a program. So Without those exceptions, cannot distribute data to you. You're also going to want your research to speak directly to the state of Michigan's top 10 strategic education plan. So we want to help improve education in the state of Michigan. We want you to help with that. And you can do so by referring to and maybe modifying your research a little bit to speak to the priorities in the state. My own thing that I would add is data security. The folks at the state take this very seriously. We take it very seriously. Even if it's not your strength, find the IT person, find the data person at your institution who knows about it, and come up with a strong plan for ensuring that. We have some resources on our website. I'm always available to chat about this stuff, but this is foundational to building trust, is having a good data security plan. Go ahead. Okay, so if you would like to apply, we have January 31st as our next deadline. So following that is March 28th of 2025. You can check out that URL. It'll have some other dates, and it'll have a link to with more information on how to apply. It'll guide you to our application portal, etc. We have implemented a cost recovery plan. So this is just to help us pay for the infrastructure, pay for my time, Jasmina's time, other staff who help build out data files and maintain them. And you can see the costs there. The difference for U of M and non-U of M has to do with cost recovery from the University of Michigan side. So that's kind of beyond our control. For matches, the cost will be dependent on how complex and in some ways how novel the match you require is. I think this goes back to you, Kevin.
Great. Oh yeah, I guess that goes back to me. And I'll say, we're talking about the Michigan system. I think it's a pretty terrific infrastructure we built here. But your research question may warrant looking in some other states. I think you'll find that actually most other states have a process that is similar to ours. And again, sort of stressing one point that Kyle made, that you almost always will have to, in some sense, justify your study to the state and their interests, and particularly to get the exemptions for FERPA. So I think the details are probably going to differ state to state, but the broad sort of process and what's available is actually going to be quite similar. So I'm just going to take the last few minutes I have here to just give you a taste of some of the things one could do with this. With the data, just highlighting two projects that I've led. This graph just shows you of the active projects that are going on right now. There's something like 70 or so. They fall in many different domains of education. Some looking at early learning, some looking at post-secondary, and then a bunch of ones related to kind of K-12. Some look at teachers, some look at just academic success. Others looking at kind of the neighborhood students are coming from. And this just gives you a window into that. So I'm going to focus on two studies. The first is a study I did with a couple of colleagues looking at K-12 enrollment during the pandemic. And then the second one is looking at pricing structures and course taking in college. So we thought this were kind of a good illustration of what you could do on the K-12 front and on the higher ed front. All right, so I'm just going to breeze through these studies, but I'm happy to share you can see the references to these two particular studies. They're published in papers. You can read them more thoroughly offline if you're so intrigued. So let me go to the first one. So first one is, we just were kind of interested in what is happening to enrollment during the pandemic. So it turned out, actually, this is, I think, highlighting the fact that many state data systems come at a higher frequency and more timely than many of the survey sources you might typically look to. And so it turned out with Michigan data, we can go and look at enrollment in K-12 schools in the state of Michigan during the pandemic at a more timely way than you could see in other survey data. So all this graph shows is basically the enrollment average per grade in Michigan public schools over time, and broken out by the four different kind of levels. And you could see, Michigan's a state that has been declining population, declining sort of public school enrollment, but in fall of 2020, you see just a massive drop down in enrollment during the first year of the pandemic, particularly for kindergarten students. But you also see it in for others as well, sort of even below trend. And then in the first sort of year, you know, that's in the first year, the full year of the pandemic, and most schools in Michigan were virtual. And then you see a recovery, but again, not fully. This type of graph, we were able to make it sort of faster than others, but you can make this with just aggregate data that is published by many states. So Michigan has a terrific portal, My Student Data. Is that what it is? I always forget that name. My Student Data, yes. That has an amazing amount of information on it to look at sort of aggregate patterns like this, and actually pretty rich crosscuts and stuff. So you could have actually made this using the data that was already available to you. So we see a big drop, right, in this first year. But what we were interested in is, where is this enrollment drop coming from? Is it students leaving? Where are they going? And then importantly, like when schools reopen, did they come back? And so that's what you could do with this data, because it's linked over time at the student level. We could answer these questions. And so this graph is basically just the share of students that like are in Michigan schools one year and then they're not the next year. Naturally, there's just some turnover. And so on average, something like 4% of students were leaving kind of every year from Michigan public districts. But you can see in the first year of the pandemic, that shoots up to 7% for kindergartners not coming back for first grade, 6% for people in elementary. Then you can see lower rates for middle school. So it shoots up in the pandemic, and then it goes down after the schools start to reopen, but still stays at an elevated level. So one thing that was cool with this data is we could say, well, where do people go? It turned out a lot of them went to homeschooling. That's sort of a flag in the data, and then a lot went into private schooling. The other categories is we just don't know, or they went out of state or whatever. And so a lot of the students went to homeschooling. And so what we could then do, again, sort of tracking students over time, is see, well, the people that went to homeschooling, do they come back? Well, it turns out, a decent chunk did. This is like all the people that were in kindergarten right before the pandemic. Did they left to homeschool for first grade, and did they come back the next year? About half of those did come back. That's what this light gray is. But then the other half didn't, right? And so this is going to have big implications for enrollment in public schools and the funding that they get. When you look at students that left for private schools, you see a lot more stickiness in terms of staying out away from the public schools. So anyways, this is a study which is very descriptive about what's going on during the pandemic, that really, I think, used the administrative data for to its potential, right? The ability to track individual students over time. In our case, we could actually see if they go to a private or homeschooling situation, and we could see if they come back. And it was quite timely, so we could look at this not real time, but as close to it as you can get with data. So that's sort of one thing with K-12. There's obviously a million other studies using this data in K-12. That's one that I worked on. Another one, which is totally different, is looking at college course taking. And so many universities charge you a flat rate. If you are a full-time student, you say, okay, if you're a full-time student, we're going to charge you $20,000 in tuition. But it turns out actually some four-year universities charge you per credit, even if you're full-time. And so in Michigan, it turns out we have kind of half and half. So this just shows you how much tuition you would pay if you attended University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. That's this blue line, as a function of the number of credits you take, right? So once you hit full-time status at my institution, you don't pay any additional tuition per semester until you get up to sort of taking 18 credits, and then you are starting to pay more. But if you're at Michigan State, which is this green line here, basically every additional credit you take, you pay more in tuition. And we were interested in, so my colleague Steve Hemelt and I were interested in whether this incentive that is built into this pricing system to take more courses, does it actually cause people to take more courses? Does it cause you to graduate faster? Does it alter the mix of courses that you took? you might think of, this is a policy tool that you could use to kind of speed up graduation and alter what courses people take. So we collected a bunch of information. This is like the first year. We did this sort of like right when the post-secondary data became available. And so this was one of the first studies that used the data that Kyle described. So we took all the students that graduated from Michigan public high schools, and then among those that were enrolled in a Michigan university somewhere in the state in 2011. And you just plot sort of the distribution of credits taken separately for those that are at schools that charge per credit and those that charge a flat rate. You see that at those that are charged a flat rate, you see a lot more people taking something like 15, 16 credits. Those that charge per credit, you see a lot more people taking 12 credits. So it does look like there's sort of a shift to taking more credits at the universities that charge, that don't make you pay more for doing so. But, these universities, people that go to these universities are slightly different. And so you worry that maybe this isn't anything about the pricing, it's something about the students or the institutions. And so in the paper, we do a bunch of analysis to kind of rule out different possible explanations. And I'll just show you, like, we do regression, we control for a bunch of stuff, we have a bunch of tables. But what you see throughout basically a bunch of different specifications is that those students that are at one of these like flat universities are about 6 to 10 percentage points more likely to be taking more than just the full-time minimum. So it does look like there's some effect of this pricing system on credit taking. Okay. And, this is a panel about STEM. And so let me tell you about course taking. Turns out we don't really see any difference in course taking, but we have their whole transcripts. It looks like those additional credits are mostly in social science and humanities, but none of the differences are statistically that distinct. But you have the full transcript, so you really could look at the whole pattern of courses that students are taking. Let me just wrap up there and actually hand it over to George to say a little bit about funding from ARA, and I think highlight on most of these other things, but we could also then leave time for questions. So George, let me hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much. This is excellent. Learning more about the Michigan data. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm George Wimberly. I'm from the American Educational Research Association, AERA. And I wanted to say a little bit about our grants program, the AERA NSF grants program, which has been around in some form since 1990, supported by the National Science Foundation. Really, our goal has been around having researchers use large-scale data sets, and these have been the federally supported data sets. And I know you started talking about some of those earlier, Kevin. Those are say from NCES, the ELS, NELS, and all too. I even had a NELS dissertation back in the day too. And we still definitely do support and encourage those use of those data sets and the new federal data sets coming from NCS or IES or NSF as well. But also we've expanded since about 2017 that we now also support use of the state longitudinal data. And we have funded many people who are using these data from states. Michigan has been one of those states, North Carolina, Florida. The list has definitely expanded over the years, as we're seeing that there's been much more widespread use. We primarily have two different types of funding. At the dissertation stage, for advanced graduate students, we offer a grant of $27,500. That's for 1 year of funding. And at the early career stage, mostly for anyone who has earned their doctorate, we also offer a research grant that's up to $35,000 for 2 years. And these grants are and all are used for things from living expenses and other research-related expenses at the dissertation stage. We encourage universities to cost share. That's always very important in terms of things around tuition and all. Also, at the research grant stage, we also have early career scholars who are typically using these for course buyout, summer salary, things of that nature. While these grants are non-renewable and in terms of direct funding, But in addition to the funding, there's also professional development and training that we offer in terms of, we do a small conference each fall for our grantees, hoping to connect them also with other senior scholars in the field who are using these data and addressing education research questions around not only the state data, but the other federally supported data sets. Right now, we do have as a priority, there's an emphasis on STEM education and STEM learning and that we are supporting, but there can be other topics still that are addressed with these data and other education research related topics that are definitely still supported. The only other thing, one thing I will say is that we will soon have a new call for proposals that will come out. And I say this will be before the end of this calendar year. And with sometime this winter, we will have a deadline for our next proposal cycle. So be on the lookout for that. In addition, and I talk about all the funding opportunities, but we also offer professional development and training for those who are looking to use these data, learning more about these data, some things that will occur during the AERA annual meeting next spring. And in April, we are in Denver, April 23rd to 27th, and registration will be open soon. And I do know that we will have a course or two that will definitely focus around large scale data sets. But then there are also things that are offered virtually through our virtual research learning center that provides some overviews around the data as well. And some of those things are online. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to see if I can put our chat and things in the chat, rather our email address here. Yeah, I see that you have that there. And if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to help and answer any questions that you may have. And if it's about our funding or as well also about our professional development and training activities around the grants.
Great,
So
thank you so much, George. Really appreciate that.
Great.
So it looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions. If folks have any questions that weren't answered during the presentation, looks like the Michigan Education Data Center staff has been doing a great job of answering, but feel free to add more. So I think I'll ask the team a question that was posed by one of the registrants to this session. They're kind of wondering about who the data is accessible to. So obviously faculty, have been using this data, but how is it, or is it accessible to students, maybe independent researchers who aren't faculty members or affiliated with an institution? Can you talk a little bit about the guidelines about who is able to use the data?
Yeah, I can start that. I think the big thing is the requirements to have your project approved by the IRB, Institutional Review Board. And so that mostly means people at research organizations, whether they be academic or kind of independent research organizations. We are not set up for people for the general public, right, that is not affiliated with some sort of research apparatus, that doesn't have an access to an IRB to access the data. For those type of individuals, we usually refer them to the My School Data website, which really has a lot of the rich kind of information that most people are interested in the aggregate. But researchers from not just Michigan, outside, and that could be graduate students, it could be faculty. Yeah, so I think that is, I think, the biggest barrier or factor, right? That and then the ability to pay the access fee, which we spent a lot of time thinking about the access fee, and it's actually like less than some of our peer organizations, but it really just covers our cost. And so those are the two kind of big barriers. Oh, there's a question about researchers outside the U.S. I think that answer is no. Is that right, Kyle? Yeah, I think that answer is no.
In general, the data will need to stay in the United States. Jasmina, you know this best, though.
Yeah, so the requesting institution or organization must be based in the United States. There could be researchers who are outside of the United States, but as long as they are accessing data, as long as the data is staying within the United States and they're accessing data through those US-based institutions, researchers may work as part of a research team if they are international, but could not be the requesting researchers.
Thanks, Jasmina.
That raises a related question. So in what format is the data made available? It sounds as if maybe people are logging in to access data that exists here at Michigan, maybe in a remote way. They're not, it doesn't sound like, you know, you are sending the data to them physically. So maybe could you talk a little bit about the access to the data in that way, and also kind of what it looks like when researchers access it, and what kind of skills they would need. So for instance, do they need to know a certain type of programming language or use a certain type of software, that type of thing?
Sure. So to start, we do, you know, as part of the data security plan, one of the reasons I stress that is because the data do get delivered out to the kind of parent institution. So that's why it's very important that, you know, as a researcher, you talk with your IT person, talk with your data security specialist, and arrange for a secure environment. And I will say it's not just one that is qualified for FERPA data, because I know many of us are at, you know, education institutes. So FERPA data is pretty much everywhere. You want to achieve kind of human subjects research levels of protection. So even though this is FERPA data, we go beyond that. In terms of what one would receive, a CSV file is most common. So we will, if approved, we would extract the data from our data warehouse into CSV format, and also accompany it with a kind of a flattened out metadata file with a one-to-one correspondence on the, you know, variable definitions and kind of column names.
Can I add one thing to that? This is one thing you might experience differently across different state systems, is how you access the data, and then how the results from your analysis can be taken out in some way. So Michigan, as Kyle said, we provide researchers with an extract, so it sits on their secure environment themselves. But there's additional thing we didn't talk about, which is that if you do some analysis, if you want to then present that or submit that to a journal, you do have to send it through a 30-day review process before it's allowed to sort of go out into the public. Other states have something very similar, but it differs in details. So some states, you do log in to the data, and then they review your output whenever you want to get it off that server. But then there's no kind of like publication review. But ours sort of has the review at the publication, or like, you know, presentation publication sort of stage, rather than at the kind of analysis stage.
Great, thank you. That's a really important point to emphasize. So it looks like we have one more question in the chat about the data and access. So this one asks, can staff help with estimating the cost for linking as part of the application? How does that process work?
Yes, so typically, I mean, even prior to submitting an application, I think if you were to just kind of give us a bit of a sense of what the linked data entails, we sort of, I guess our matching process, and Kyle can talk more about this with you sort of in a quick offline meeting as well. We kind of bucket it by complexity and by the number of records. And so if you kind of just give us a sense of what exactly you're hoping to match, I think we can give you, you know, sort of a ballpark estimate. And then as we sort of get, you know, closer to approval and through the application stage, we can look at things in more detail and discuss.
Okay, great. So I have kind of more about a higher order question. You guys are all the experts in this data, and we have an audience here that I'm sure would love, you know, from your perspective, what aspects of the data do you think are particularly promising or maybe underutilized for educational research that you experts say, you know what, researchers out there, you should really check this part of the data out or consider using it for this purpose? Do you have anything you can share?
And we've had a couple questions on the early learning, so the 0 to 5 span. And I think especially the fact that we can connect those into the K-12 data sets makes it pretty unique. And they haven't gotten much use. That's a relatively new data set to us. I will say we are working very hard on on a similar set of career and technical education researcher data files, which will be brand new. Those should start, I think, around academic year 2013. Don't quote me on that. But we'll cover the instructors, students, assessments, certifications gained, So that'll be a whole new area of data for us as that comes through. And theoretically, someday in the future, we might be able to connect, for example, a teacher at the state of Michigan to their education records when they were a student. And so those labor economists might be going to find that interesting, but that's no promises there.
Yeah, I agree with both of those domains. I think one sort of broader kind of implication of what you're saying, Kyle, is that like the data system now has like been around for long, medium term. And so you do have this ability to sort of follow people for quite a while now, all through now kind of early childhood into the uppers of K-12, and then from early K-12 into post-secondary. And so thinking about kind of some of the longer term consequences of various things, at least long-term educational outcomes, I think is something the data hasn't really been used for a whole lot, just because that's something you can only do kind of recently. The only other thing I would add is just, this is something that I'm more interested in, and Allison, you know this about me, but the course taking data, particularly of the college students, I think, is used, but I don't think it's used in the same, to its potential, right? People usually use it in the way that I sort of showed, which is, how many courses you take that are in social sciences or math or whatever. But we know that particular courses, and so you could do a lot more with that than we have in the past. Looking at the paths that people take and the complexity of people's college trajectories, I think would be quite interesting.
Great. And then are there any holes in the data that people should be aware of? Like maybe they had just assumed the data includes, some key variables that education data tends to contain, but in this particular instance, for some historical reason, this data does not. Anything folks should be aware of in that way?
Yeah, there are nuances, to be certain. So just as an example, let's see here, well, with the course taking data, started out, it's fully collected for a small period of a window, and then the requirements change and it drops off.
That's a high school course taking, just to be clear.
High school course taking, high school discipline. So you'll see these policy changes and reporting requirements in the data. There are also phases where we go from the state's first longitudinal data system to its current one, and we are harmonizing essentially two different databases together, trying to line up and create a full panel. So you'll see drops, you'll see variables come in 2012 or drop in 2012, depending on which direction you're going. And you need to watch out for that. And we're actually working on some ways to document and expose that. But just because I say it starts 2004 doesn't mean every single variable starts in 2004.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you very much for pointing that out. So unfortunately, I think we're out of time and we're going to need to stop here. But I want to thank all our panelists for sharing the presentation and their time and all this great information we learned about the data. I want to thank everyone in the audience as well for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.